Commentary on Daniel 8:15 to 27. Daniel 8:15 to 27 brings the vision of the ram, the goat, and the little horn to its conclusion. Daniel is given an explanation by the angel Gabriel, revealing that God rules over the rise and fall of kingdoms and that history unfolds according to his determined purpose. The passage ultimately points to the triumph of God's kingdom and the complete accomplishment of his redemptive plan. Daniel 8, verse 15 to 17. Gabriel explains the vision. As Daniel seeks understanding, a figure with the appearance of a man stands before him. Gabriel is commissioned to explain the vision. The first lesson is that God desires his people to understand his purposes. Daniel did not invent the meaning of the vision. Its interpretation came from heaven. Scripture consistently teaches that God reveals himself to his people through his word. Gabriel tells Daniel that the vision concerns the time of the end. This phrase should be understood in light of Daniel's historical setting. Throughout Daniel, the end often refers to the conclusion of a particular age or covenantal period, rather than the destruction of the physical universe. The vision concerns the completion of God's dealings with the kingdoms that oppressed his covenant people. The events described would unfold according to God's sovereign timetable. Daniel falls on his face in awe. Encounters with God's glory often remind humanity of its weakness and dependence upon divine grace. Daniel 8:18 to 22. The ram and the goat. Gabriel identifies the symbols plainly. The ram represents the kingdoms of Media and Persia. The goat represents Greece. The large horn is its first king, historically fulfilled in the remarkable rise of Alexander the Great. His rapid conquest of the known world demonstrated the truth that earthly power is temporary and dependent upon God's sovereign will. When the great horn is broken, 4 kingdoms arise in its place. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals. Daniel's prophecy emphasizes an important theological truth. God controls history. Kings rise because God permits it. Empires fall because God determines it. No political power can frustrate God's purposes. The unfolding of these events demonstrates that history is not random, but directed by divine wisdom toward God's intended goal. Daniel 8:23 to 25. The fierce king. A king of fierce countenance arises from one of these kingdoms. Historically, this figure closely matches the career of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who brutally persecuted the Jewish people and desecrated the temple. He gains influence through intrigue and deception. He destroys many. He opposes God's people. He magnifies himself. He attacks the Holy Covenant. Yet Daniel also presents him as a pattern of arrogant human government that exalts itself against God. Throughout biblical history, earthly rulers repeatedly attempt to establish themselves as ultimate authorities. The little horn's success is temporary because God has established limits to evil's reign. Daniel says he will be broken without human hand. This language highlights God's direct intervention. Human empires ultimately collapse because they cannot withstand God's kingdom. The victory belongs to God alone. Daniel 8:26. The certainty of the vision. Gabriel assures Daniel that the vision is true. Daniel is instructed to preserve the revelation because its fulfillment would come in the future from his perspective. This demonstrates God's faithfulness. Prophecy is not speculation, but divine revelation. The fulfillment of the Persian and Greek portions of the prophecy gives confidence that God accomplishes everything he promises. The God who directs history never loses control of events. Daniel 8:27. Daniel's response. Daniel becomes physically exhausted by what he has seen. The weight of God's revelation overwhelms him. Yet he returns to his responsibilities while carrying the knowledge of God's sovereign plan. His response teaches that understanding prophecy should not lead to fear or withdrawal from life. Instead, believers trust God's purposes while faithfully fulfilling the work he has given them. Daniel does not understand every detail immediately, reminding readers that some aspects of God's plan become clearer as history unfolds. Theological themes. God's sovereignty over history. Daniel 8 demonstrates that kingdoms and rulers exist under God's authority. Persia, Greece, Alexander, the divided kingdoms, the persecuting ruler, each serves a temporary role within God's larger purpose. History moves according to God's decree rather than human ambition. Evil has limits. The fierce king appears powerful, but his authority is restricted. His rise is permitted. His actions are measured. His downfall is certain. evil never escapes God's control. The triumph of God's kingdom. The persecuting powers of Daniel's vision ultimately fail. Human empires rise and disappear, but God's kingdom endures. The temporary victories of wicked rulers cannot overturn God's covenant purposes. The fulfillment of redemption. The oppression of God's people and the desecration of the sanctuary anticipate God's ultimate work of restoration. The sacrifices and temple system belonged to an old covenant order that pointed forward to a greater reality. The work of redemption accomplished through Christ establishes a lasting access to God that cannot be destroyed by earthly rulers or corrupted sanctuaries. The earthly temple could be profaned by kings, but God's true dwelling with his people rests upon a covenant that cannot be shaken. Conclusion. Daniel 8:15-27 reveals that God governs history with perfect wisdom. The rise of empires, the oppression of God's people, and the arrogance of earthly rulers all occur within his sovereign plan. The vision's historical fulfillments demonstrate God's faithfulness to his word and assure believers that evil's apparent victories are temporary. The chapter encourages confidence that God's redemptive purposes cannot fail. Earthly kingdoms pass away. Proud rulers are broken without human intervention, and God's covenant promises stand secure. Daniel's vision ultimately directs attention away from fear of political powers and toward trust in the God who rules history and brings his saving purposes to their appointed completion.